As the man on the street extended his hand, asking for a single dollar, no one could have anticipated how this moment would unfold. What began as an act of simple generosity would ignite a movement, mend broken ties, and transform lives in unimaginable ways. The city of Riverside hummed with life, car horns blaring, pedestrians weaving through crowded sidewalks, and the endless murmur of voices filling the crisp winter air. On the corner of Park Avenue and 12th Street, just outside a weathered bookstore, a man slumped against the brick wall. His name was Ethan. At 43, life had worn him down to the threads of his second-hand jacket. A tattered cardboard sign rested beside him, bearing the words, "Anything helps. God bless." For nearly a year, Ethan had called the streets home. A cascade of misfortunes, a factory closure, a series of illnesses, and the loss of his apartment had stripped him of everything he once held close. Survival was a daily gamble. Sometimes a stranger would toss him a few coins, but mostly, people hurried past, avoiding his gaze as if acknowledging him might cost them more than they could afford. Shivering, Ethan pulled his threadbare beanie tighter over his ears and let his eyes drift over the steady stream of shoes walking by. Scuffed boots, polished loafers, sneakers of every color. He didn't expect much, but then, just a few feet away, a pair of pristine white sneakers stopped abruptly. These weren't ordinary shoes. They were the kind that spoke of youth, privilege, and a world far removed from Ethan's. His curiosity stirred, and he looked up. Standing there was a teenager, tall, composed, and holding an air of quiet confidence. The boy's sleek dark jacket reflected the faint winter sunlight as he stood scrolling through his phone. Ethan squinted, trying to place the face. It seemed familiar, but he couldn't quite identify it. Around them, whispers began to ripple through the bustling sidewalk. Some people paused to snap discreet pictures. The boy seemed oblivious to the growing attention, his calm demeanor contrasting with the city's hurried chaos. Ethan hesitated. He rarely initiated conversation unless someone made eye contact first, but something about the boy's stillness, his lack of rush, felt different. Gathering his courage, Ethan forced a smile and called out, his voice hoarse from the cold. "Hey kid, got a dollar to spare?" The boy froze, mid-scroll, and tilted his head as though to confirm he'd heard correctly. Slowly he turned toward Ethan, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the world seemed to quiet. Ethan braced himself for the usual, averted eyes, a quick dismissal, or maybe an awkward apology. Instead, the boy's calm, steady voice surprised him. "What do you need it for?" The question wasn't harsh or judgmental, but its weight caught Ethan off guard. He cleared his throat, unsure how to respond. A cup of coffee," he muttered, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "Maybe a sandwich if I'm lucky." The boy took a step closer, slipping his phone into his pocket, and Ethan felt the stares of passers-by intensify. He wanted to disappear beneath their silent judgment, but the boy's eyes held his, unyielding. "What's your name?" the boy asked. "Ethan," he replied, barely audible. The boy nodded thoughtfully, his brow furrowing as though he were piecing together a puzzle far larger than this moment. "I'm Simon," he said simply. There was no arrogance in his tone, just a sincerity that took Ethan by surprise. The boy crouched down, meeting Ethan at eye level. It was a gesture so unexpected it made Ethan flinch. Nobody had ever done that, spoken to him on equal ground. "How long have you been out here?" Simon asked, his voice low and even. Ethan hesitated. People didn't usually ask for the story behind the man. They only saw his worn clothes and tired eyes. But there was something in Simon's gaze, an unspoken promise that he was listening. Ethan swallowed hard. "Almost a year now," he admitted. "Lost my job when the plant closed. Then my health went south, and I couldn't keep up with rent." His voice cracked, and he looked away. "It all just fell apart." Simon listened without interrupting, his expressions softening with concern. Ethan felt a strange mix of vulnerability and relief. Here was someone who didn't just see him, but seemed to care. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt like more than just another face in the crowd. This boy, this stranger, had stopped. And somehow Ethan sensed this was only the beginning of something he couldn't yet comprehend. People rarely cared about the why behind Ethan's situation. For them, his misfortune was just another fleeting image of despair on the streets of Riverside. But Simon's calm, steady demeanor disarmed him. "Almost a year now," Ethan admitted, his voice low and uneven. Lost my job when the factory shut down. Then my health, it went downhill fast, couldn't keep up with rent. He paused, swallowing hard as a lump formed in his throat. It's been all downhill since. Simon listened intently, his sharp blue eyes narrowing, not in judgment but in focus. It was a look Ethan wasn't used to, a strange mix of curiosity and concern, as though Simon was piecing together a puzzle far more complex than Ethan's story alone. Ethan became acutely aware of the quiet tension rising in the crowd that had begun to form around them. People were pausing, whispering, their attention drawn to the unusual sight of a well-dressed teenager crouched on the sidewalk beside a man who looked like he had lost everything. "What about your family?" Simon asked after a moment of silence. Ethan's jaw tightened and he looked away. "Don't really have one anymore," he said, his voice rough. "My parents passed a long time ago. My brother..." He let out a bitter laugh. "Well, we haven't spoken in years." His shoulders sagged as he added, "Not much left to lose when you've already lost it all." Simon was quiet again, his gaze steady as though carefully considering Ethan's words. Then, without breaking eye contact, he reached into the pocket of his sleek jacket. Ethan's pulse quickened. He'd asked for $1, just one, but Simon's deliberate movements hinted at something else entirely. When Simon's hand emerged, he wasn't holding a single bill but a crisp $100 note. Ethan blinked, struggling to comprehend the sight. "Here," Simon said, holding the bill out toward him. "This should cover more than just coffee." Ethan stared at the money, stunned. For a long moment he couldn't move. It wasn't just the amount, it was the sheer humanity behind the gesture. "Are you serious?" Ethan finally managed, his voice cracking. Simon shrugged lightly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Because I can," he said simply, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. The simplicity of the answer left Ethan speechless. Before he could fully respond, Simon leaned in slightly, his voice softening. "But listen," he added, his tone serious, "this isn't just about the money. I need you to promise me something." "What's that?" Ethan asked, his fingers gripping the $100 bill like it might vanish if he let go. Simon's expression grew firm, his sincerity unshakable. "If I help you today, you have to promise to help yourself tomorrow. Deal?" The words hit Ethan harder than he expected. They weren't just kind, they were challenging, urging him to rise above his circumstances. His throat tightened, but he nodded slowly, unable to find the right words. "Good," Simon said, straightening and brushing his knees. He glanced at the crowd that had gathered, his composure unbroken by the curious stares or the phones pointed in their direction. Ethan felt his face flush, heat rising to his cheeks. The growing audience made him feel both grateful and embarrassed. Simon reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out a small notepad and pen. Scribbling quickly, he tore off a piece of paper and handed it to Ethan. "Go to this address tomorrow morning," Simon said, his voice even. "They'll help you out. Tell them Simon sent you." Ethan unfolded the note, his hands trembling slightly. It was an address, a local shelter and resource center Ethan had heard of but never visited, too proud and ashamed to seek help. "I'll make sure they're expecting you," Simon added, his tone unwavering. Ethan stared at the paper and the money in his hands, as though they were foreign objects. His mind raced, caught between disbelief and cautious hope. It wasn't just the act of kindness, it was the sense of possibility. Simon didn't leave immediately. Instead, he lingered, watching Ethan with an intensity that felt almost unnerving, as though he were waiting for something, acknowledgement or maybe commitment. Ethan cleared his throat, his voice shaky. "Why?" he asked, the question spilling out before he could stop it. "Why do you care? You don't even know me." Simon tilted his head slightly, a faint smile touching his lips. "Because everyone has a story, Ethan," he said. "Yours just hasn't been told yet." He glanced at the crowd beginning to murmur louder. "And honestly, if I'm in a position to do something good, why wouldn't I?" Ethan was taken aback. He'd heard countless hollow words over the years, but Simon's voice carried a weight that felt unshakably genuine. Even so, doubt crept in. "You don't owe me anything," Ethan said, his tone firmer now. "I've been out here long enough to know people don't stop to help without expecting something in return." Simon crouched down again, his eyes meeting Ethan's. "I don't expect anything," he said quietly. "But I do believe that small actions can lead to something bigger." Ethan tightened his grip on the note, feeling the faint flicker of hope Simon's words had sparked. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew this wasn't just a moment. It was the beginning of something new. Simon crouched down again, meeting Ethan's gaze on level ground. "I'm not expecting anything from you," he said firmly. "But I believe small actions can lead to bigger things." He gestured to the note in Ethan's hand. "That place has resources, job programs, counseling, and whatever else you might need. All I'm asking is that you show up." Ethan swallowed hard, a lump forming in his throat. He looked down at the note again, the address neatly scrawled across the scrap of paper. He wanted to believe it was real, that this was his chance. But years of disappointment had taught him to temper hope with caution. "What if I can't do it? What if I screw it up?" Ethan asked, his voice tinged with doubt. Simon smiled faintly, shaking his head. "Everyone screws up, Ethan. That's life. But giving up? That's the only way you lose." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that hit Ethan harder than he expected. For a moment, the noise of the bustling city seemed to fade away. All he could hear was the steady conviction in Simon's voice. The crowd around them had grown noticeably thicker. Phones were now openly pointed in their direction, capturing the unusual exchange. Ethan shifted uncomfortably under the weight of so many eyes. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, and the spotlight felt suffocating. Simon, on the other hand, seemed unfazed. If anything, he appeared to thrive under the pressure, his calm presence a stark contrast to Ethan's unease. "Ignore them," Simon said softly, as if sensing his discomfort. "This isn't about them. It's about you and me, right here, right now. Nothing else matters." Ethan felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. For the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't feel invisible. Someone saw him, really saw him, and cared enough to listen. "All right," Ethan said finally, his voice steadier now. "I'll go. I'll show up." Simon's expression softened, a genuine smile breaking across his face. "That's all I wanted to hear." He stood, brushing off his knees, then turned to glance at the crowd. Raising his voice slightly, he added, "And Ethan, don't forget, you've got more strength in you than you realize." Ethan blinked, overwhelmed by a mix of emotions, gratitude, embarrassment, and something else he couldn't quite name. He wanted to say something, but no words came. Instead, he nodded, clutching the note tightly in his hand like a lifeline. As Simon turned to leave, the crowd parted for him, their whispers growing louder. Ethan watched as Simon's figure disappeared into the flow of people, blending seamlessly back into the city. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a flicker of something he thought he had lost: hope. The next morning, Ethan stood outside the address Simon had given him. It was a modest brick building in a quieter part of Riverside, its entrance marked by a simple sign that read, "Renewal Resource Center." A small stream of people came and went, some carrying grocery bags, others looking as uncertain as Ethan felt. He slipped a hand into his pocket, tracing the edges of the note, as if to remind himself, this wasn't a dream. The $100 bill Simon had given him was still tucked safely in his jacket. Part of him wanted to save it, to cling to it as proof that the previous day had actually happened. But another part, the part stirred by Simon's words, whispered that this wasn't just about the money. It was about a chance to start over. Taking a deep breath, Ethan stepped inside. The warmth of the building embraced him, a sharp contrast to the biting cold outside. Behind the reception desk sat a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a welcoming smile. She looked up as he approached. "How can I help you today?" Ethan hesitated, then pulled the note from his pocket and slid it across the counter. Simon sent me," he said, his voice uneven. "Said I should come here." The woman glanced at the paper, and a knowing smile spread across her face. "You must be Ethan. We've been expecting you." She stood and gestured for him to follow. "Come on, let's get you started." The next few hours passed in a blur. Ethan met with a caseworker who listened to his story without judgment, outlining a plan to help him rebuild his life. They arranged for him to stay in the shelter temporarily, set up a doctor's appointment to address his health concerns, and enrolled him in a job training program. It was overwhelming, but for the first time in years, Ethan felt as though the pieces of his shattered life were being carefully picked up and put back together. That evening, as he sat on the edge of his cot in the shelter, Ethan replayed the events of the past 24 hours in his mind. The kindness of a stranger, the offer of help, the simple act of being seen. It all felt surreal. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan allowed himself to believe that change was possible. Simon's words about the promise Ethan had made to help himself stayed with him. It wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time, Ethan truly believed it was possible. Meanwhile, outside the walls of the shelter, Simon's gesture began to ripple far beyond what either of them could have imagined. A bystander had captured a video of their interaction, and by the next morning, it had spread across social media like wildfire. Headlines praised the mysterious young benefactor's act of generosity. The footage showed Simon kneeling beside Ethan, handing him the crisp bill, and speaking words of encouragement that resonated deeply with millions of viewers. Some dismissed it as a publicity stunt, while others hailed it as a rare act of genuine compassion from someone in a position of privilege. Regardless of the debate, one thing was undeniable. The video captured something raw and authentic that touched people across all walks of life. As news of the video grew, people began reaching out to the Renewal Resource Center, offering donations and support inspired by Simon's actions. Ethan, however, remained blissfully unaware that his story had become the center of a national conversation. His focus was on the steps ahead, attending his first counseling session, submitting job applications, and, for the first time in years, daring to believe in himself. That night, as Ethan lay on the modest cot provided by the shelter, the weight of the past year seemed to lift slightly. Somewhere out there, the young man who had stopped to help him was making waves. But Ethan's focus was clear. Take it one day at a time, and honor the promise he had made. By the end of the week, subtle yet powerful changes began to take shape. At the shelter, the staff treated him with a kindness he hadn't felt in years. They offered not only practical support, but also words of encouragement, reminding him that his story wasn't over. Word of Ethan's journey began to spread within the shelter community. Others, struggling in silence, found inspiration in his willingness to take the first step. "If you can do it, maybe I can too," one man said, patting Ethan on the back. Though the gesture was simple, it filled Ethan with an unfamiliar sense of pride. Outside the shelter, however, Ethan's story was anything but quiet. The video of his interaction with Simon had gone viral, racking up millions of views in just a few days. News outlets picked up the story, dissecting every detail. Commentators debated Simon's motivations, while viewers across the country shared their thoughts online. "Privilege with a purpose," one tweet read. "This is how you use it for good." Another post remarked, "It's sad that kindness like this is so rare it shocks us. Kudos to Simon for showing us it's possible." Ethan only learned about the attention when a shelter staff member showed him the video. Watching himself on the small screen, Ethan felt a strange mix of emotions: embarrassment, gratitude, and something he couldn't quite name. He barely recognized the man staring back at him: hollow eyes, slumped shoulders, a defeated posture. It was a stark reminder of how far he had fallen, and how far he could rise. Meanwhile, Simon stayed silent amidst the growing buzz. He turned down interview requests, avoided public statements, and ignored the online frenzy. For him, it wasn't about the attention or praise, it was about Ethan. Quietly, Simon worked behind the scenes to ensure the shelter received substantial donations, allowing them to expand their programs and help even more people like Ethan. The video sparked something far greater than either of them could have anticipated. Across the country, people began sharing their own small acts of kindness, tagging them with hashtags like Kindness Challenge and Pay It Forward. Local organizations reported a surge in donations, and volunteers stepped forward in droves, inspired by the simplicity of Simon's gesture. For Ethan, the ripple effect became deeply personal. One evening, as he sat in the shelter's common room, he noticed a man approaching hesitantly. There was something familiar about him. "Ethan?" the man asked, his voice trembling slightly. Ethan squinted, trying to place the face. Then it clicked. "Mark," he stammered, his voice shaking. It was his younger brother, the one he hadn't spoken to in over a decade. The two men stared at each other, the weight of lost years hanging heavily in the air. "I saw the video," Mark admitted, sitting down beside him. I didn't know things had gotten so bad for you. I should have reached out." Ethan shook his head, fighting back tears. "It's not your fault," he said quietly. "I didn't exactly make it easy for anyone to find me." Mark placed a firm hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Well, I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." The reunion was bittersweet, a reminder of everything they had lost, but also of what could still be rebuilt. For Ethan, it was yet another step toward healing, not just of his circumstances, but of his relationships and his sense of self. As the days passed, Ethan began to see his story not as a tragedy, but as a testament to resilience. Though his road ahead was long, he carried with him a renewed sense of purpose. Fueled by the kindness of a stranger who had given him more than money, he had given him hope. Ethan shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. "It's not your fault," he said quietly. "I didn't exactly make it easy for anyone to find me." Mark placed a firm hand on Ethan's shoulder, his voice steady but full of emotion. "Well, I'm here now," he said, "and I'm not going anywhere." The reunion was bittersweet. It was a stark reminder of the years they had lost, but also of the possibility of starting anew. For Ethan, reconnecting with his brother was more than just a family reunion. It was another step toward healing. It wasn't just about fixing his circumstances anymore. It was about mending his relationships and rediscovering his sense of self. As the weeks passed, Ethan began to see his story in a new light. It wasn't simply a tale of hardship or loss. It was a testament to resilience, to the human ability to rise again when given even the smallest flicker of hope. Though his road ahead was still uncertain, Ethan carried with him a renewed sense of purpose. Simon's act of kindness had been more than just a monetary gesture. It had been a catalyst for change, a reminder that even when the world feels overwhelmingly dark, a single spark can reignite the fire within. Ethan moved forward, step by step, holding on to that hope with both hands. And for the first time in years, he believed he could build a life worth living again.